Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Heidekoper. Today I'd like to tell you the story of a place rather than a work of art. It's the Piazza Navona in Rome, which of course contains a significant work of art, which is the great big fountain in the middle of it. It's known as the Fountain of the Four Rivers by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. But before we get to it, I would like to tell you something about the history of the piazza, and you will see that the history of the place and the fountain, they tie into one another in unexpected ways. So, let's get into it. By the way, I'm going to refer to the place as a piazza instead of the word square, because I'm never sure whether or not you should call a place like this a square in English, as it's so very much not a square in shape. So, piazza. And today it's one of those wonderful places to visit in Rome. You can see the fountains, you can have a coffee there in one of the many cafes on the piazza, which, by the way, may be a little bit more expensive than in other places, but then again, it's quite a view, isn't it? But I'm sure it won't surprise you to know that the piazza itself didn't start out as a piazza, but as something completely different, and its history goes back almost 2,000 years. Today, when you look at the piazza on a map or a satellite image from Google Maps, like you are doing now, you might notice that it has a peculiar shape. It kind of resembles the shape of the Circus Maximus, which is also in Rome. That's that place over here. That was once a huge stadium used for chariot racing, and that similar shape is not a coincidence, because the Piazza Navona was first conceived of as a sports arena. It was built during the reign of Emperor Domitian, which was at the end of the 1st century. Now, if you're not familiar, Domitian was the third emperor of the second dynasty of emperors. The Roman Empire, as in having an emperor, had started about a century before with Augustus and the Julian-Claudian dynasty, and it ended with Nero. And Nero had been famous, or infamous, for his decadence, and he had expanded his palace and his gardens to the very heart of Rome. They actually bordered on the Forum Romanum. And he did this after the area had been cleared of housing by the Great Fire of Rome. And although it has to be said that he built entire new neighborhoods for people who had become homeless in the Great Fire, he was seen as extremely elitist to have his palace built on that location, right on top of the places where an entire neighborhood of the plebs or the common people had stood before. Now, the reason I tell you this is that he was succeeded by Vespasian. Not directly, by the way. There was a power vacuum right after Nero died, and it was a quick series of civil wars that even raged within the city, and it led to Rome having 4 emperors in 1 year. But after the dust had settled, Vespasian was the guy at the helm. And he quickly removed the gardens of Nero and instead built the Colosseum right there, which, instead of a private garden, was an arena for the people. Because the Colosseum, even though it wasn't called the Colosseum yet, was built for games, gladiatorial fights and shows, but it was always free to enter for anyone, although you were seated according to your rank within the empire. But Vespasian was much more of an emperor for the people, and he was succeeded by his son Titus, who reigned for only just over 2 years, and Titus in turn was succeeded by his brother, so the second son of Vespasian, and that was Domitian. He stayed in power for 15 years, which by that time was considered a very long time for an emperor. So the 3 of them, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, formed the Flavian dynasty. And part of their policies were to create lots of public buildings and expanding the city of Rome. So Domitian started building an expansion of the city towards the northwest. It's a slightly lower part of the landscape, and so it had been marshes, and they had been drained by ditches that were probably already started under the reign of his father Vespasian, but by the time that Domitian took power, they could start building there. And he planned a large series of temples, bathhouses, libraries, and one sports arena. And to give you some idea of what that looked like, we can turn to the famous model of Rome as it may have looked in the 4th century. This model was developed in the 1930s and is now in an historical museum, which is really worth a visit if you ever visit the city of Rome. But from this angle, we can see the Colosseum in the distance, sort of next to it, so we can see the Circus Maximus, and if we look in this direction, you see a sports arena. And to give you an idea, the plan was to have a lot of temples to the east of it, which is that direction, and you can still see on the model the Pantheon, which was a later rebuilding of the temple that Domitian had built there. Now, obviously, they already had a number of big sports arenas in Rome that was the aforementioned Circus Maximus that was used for chariot racing, and that was much bigger than this one. And of course they had the Colosseum, but that wasn't really for sports. Well, for a specific sport of gladiatorial fighting, and it has to be said, all kinds of other performances, but it's of course famous for its gladiator fights. But this one had to be something completely new to the Romans. It was an arena intended for athletic competition, so running, throwing javelins. Apparently it had competitions with bows and arrows, but most of it had to do with competitions of running, jumping and throwing things. These were collectively known as games, or in Latin, agones. And the arena was known as the Circus Agonalis, which means arena for games or competitions. And it may surprise you that this was new to Rome. Competitions in what we now call athletics were already held and had been held in Greece for centuries, but they were typically Greek, and Romans didn't really have a taste for it, even though they adopted so many different Greek customs into their culture. But one of the main objections they had is that the Greek used to do all of this naked. And the Romans didn't like that idea at all. So we know that the people actually had objections to that, and as far as we know, the Roman athletic competitions were not done in the nude, but with some sort of pants on. And for a while this became a popular spectator sport, although it has to be said it never came anywhere near the popularity of the more bloody and exciting sports of gladiatorial fights and chariot racing. And after Rome fell into decline in the 5th century, this stadium wasn't used for anything, so over time it was reduced to rubble. Because you have to imagine that the city of Rome almost entirely disappeared for a time. In its heyday, in ancient times, there were 1.5 million people who lived in the city. But at the end of the Middle Ages, in round about 1400, the estimates are that there were fewer than 25,000 people living there. And they lived amongst these ancient and overgrown ruins that spread out over a large area. And of course it didn't help that for a long time during the Middle Ages, for about a century in fact, the popes didn't live in Rome, but were based in Avignon, and that meant that the city would decline even further. But when the popes returned in 1417, the city started to grow again. Gradually more money was invested in the rebuilding of the city and the clearing of some of the ancient monuments, but for this arena there was never any hope of rebuilding it, because the popes were simply not interested in building sports arenas. However, it did offer a large open space that was made into a marketplace. And during the 15th century, people started building houses on the ruins of the old bleachers or the stands of the old arena. And that's how the square got its peculiar shape. And it was probably also around this time that the name of the old arena, of the Circus Agonalis, or the word for the games, the agones, were corrupted into navones, and later navona, hence the name of the piazza. These days you can still see parts of the old stands on this side of the piazza. On the outside, I should say. On the north side, outside the piazza, you can see this on the side of a building. But just around the corner from there, there's actually an entrance to a museum, and if you go there, you can actually walk around in part of the old ruins underneath the buildings. But by the end of the 15th century, it had become a market square, and in the 16th century, several of the prominent families of Rome had their houses built on these stands and bleachers. One of those families was called Pamphili, and they would become much more influential during the 17th century. But in the 16th, they already had a large house, let's call it a palace, on what was by now known as the Piazza Navona. And also during the 16th century, they enlarged the aqueduct that led to the piazza. Now, I'm sure you know that the Romans used these aqueducts that were sometimes buildings above ground to lead water from far away into the city. But by the time it reached the city, it was often put into underground aqueducts, which were basically a system of water pipes. And several of those still function today. There was one that terminated at what is now the Trevi Fountain, but they extended that one all the way to the Piazza Navona. And this is significant for us because that same ancient aqueduct still provides the water for the fountains of the Piazza Navona today. Now there are 3 fountains, and the first 2 of these they started building in the last quarter of the 16th century, and for that job they contracted Giacomo della Porta. And he was a pretty big deal. He was a colleague and co-worker of Michelangelo, and he had assisted him in finishing a number of his bigger projects, like the Dome of St. Peter's and the square at the top of the Capitoline Hill. But he would also make his own original work, such as the facade of Il Gesù. Now it would take too much time here to explain exactly why, but that's the first building that was named Baroque, which was at first a derogatory term, but it would of course become the style of the following century. And he was commissioned to make these two fountains on either side of the piazza. But it has to be said that they were not his most spectacular work, mainly because all he built were the basins, with some of these spouting tritons and dolphins in it. The rest of the sculptures in them are from a much later date, because you have to understand that in the 16th century, fountains like these were purely utilitarian in nature. People went there to get water for their households. Plumbing didn't exist yet. Well, not for anybody but the very rich. And in this case, for instance, this sculpture of a Moor wrestling a dolphin was made by Bernini in the 1670s, which is decades after he finished the main fountain. And at the other side of the square, this lovely Neptune fighting an octopus wasn't added until about 300 years after the original fountain had been built. It was made in the 1870s by Antonio della Bitta, and then Gregoria Zappala added all the cupids and nereids and such. But it's, of course, right in between these two fountains, at the center of the piazza, that Bernini was commissioned to build his fountain. And when he got the job, there had only been two very basic fountains on either side of the piazza. Now, Bernini had been a hugely successful artist. He had been more or less discovered by a man named Scipione Borghese, who was a cardinal and had been cardinal nephew to Pope Paul V, and he was a very influential cardinal and art collector. And you can still see his incredible collection in the Villa Borghese in Rome. So the Borghese family gave Bernini his start, and he was not only a great artist, but also very good in behaving in the social circles of the Vatican. And so he managed to get an enormous amount of commissions out of a succession of popes, like Urban VIII and Gregory XV. But in 1644 a different pope was elected, and his name was Innocent X, but he had been born as Giovan Battista Pamphili. And his family came from a very different faction within Rome from the one that Borghese had been from, or for that matter his own predecessor, Urban VIII, had been in. And that meant that Innocent X rejected almost everything his predecessor had done in matters of art and design. And for that reason, the fortunes of Bernini changed overnight. Where he had been the favorite artist of the Pope and of many of his cardinals, suddenly he was shunned by the entire Vatican. There were no more new commissions, and funds for his old commissions, the ones that were underway, were often stopped, which was obviously a big problem for Bernini personally, but also to his business and all the people that depended on him, because he had built a large workshop with lots of assistants that he now had to fire. And then the Pope decided to redecorate his own part of the city, that is the part his family came from, and that, as I mentioned before, was the Piazza Navona. First, he decided to rebuild and expand his family's palace on the Piazza Navona, and for that he invited a number of architects to come up with designs, but he explicitly excluded Bernini from entering the competition. Then he commissioned a group of sculptors to design a new fountain that would be placed in the piazza, that first and foremost was to be placed there because he wanted to display an obelisk that he had bought. So basically the fountain was just an excuse to show off an obelisk. And again, he specifically said Bernini was not to compete for this commission. But according to one of his earliest biographers, a plan was devised to trick the Pope. According to the story, a friend of Bernini's came up with the plan. His name was Prince Niccolò Ludovici, and he was married to a niece of the Pope's, and so he was invited to a dinner at the family home of the Pamphili on the Piazza Navona. So Ludovici told Bernini to prepare a model of his fountain design, and he would place it in one of the rooms that the Pope had to pass through after dinner. And the story goes that the Pope passed this model and admired it greatly and said, "This must be the winner," only then to be told that it was a design by Bernini. And supposedly he said that he wanted to use it despite the fact that he didn't want to use Bernini, but, and I quote, "He who desires not to use Bernini's designs must take care not to see them," end quote. And so Bernini got the job. Now, this was the year 1646, and 5 years later it was unveiled on the piazza. By the way, the palace of the Pope, or at least his family, was demolished at the same time because it was going to be rebuilt and enlarged. For that task, the Pope had hired Girolamo Rinaldi, who was a competent, albeit somewhat conservative choice. But there was another architect that had sent in a design that was much more radical. That had been done by a man called Francesco Borromini. Now, Borromini was a brilliant architect, highly innovative and one of the great minds of the art world of the Baroque era, although his earliest biographers also said that he was socially awkward, neurotic and hard to work with, which made him in social circles sort of an opposite to the flamboyant and easygoing Bernini. And art historians have often made much of their competition. It's often been remarked that they competed for the same jobs and must have been rivals or even enemies. But the reality is slightly different and less exciting. Borromini had long worked on projects by Bernini. He simply worked for his firm as an architect, and Bernini, on at least 2 different occasions, recommended Borromini to be chosen as the architect to build 2 separate churches. So there may not have been that much animosity and competition between the two after all, although it may have stung Bernini that Borromini became a favorite of the new Pope Innocent X, especially when Bernini himself was being denied even the chance to compete for commissions. So his former employees seemed to now surpass him, at least in the favor of the Pope. But the fact that the Pope hired Borromini for his palace was a bit strange, because he would be an advisor to the main architect, Rinaldi, and it wasn't exactly clear what his contribution was going to be. But that would become apparent a few years later when the Pope commissioned Borromini to build the church of Sant'agnese in Agone, which is also on the Piazza Navona, and I'm not going to go into much detail on that church here, because that's for another video. But historians and art historians have often made much of the competition of these 2 great minds of the Baroque that were making these 2 masterpieces right next to each other, because it's the church that's right next to the fountain. And it's kind of fun to see that it's somewhat integrated with the fairly boring design of the Palazzo Pamphili next door. That palazzo, by the way, is now the Brazilian embassy, but is open to the public on occasion, at least part of it. But now let's have a closer look at the fountain, which, as I said before, is called the Fountain of the 4 Rivers. Originally, the plan was that it just had to be something to hold up this big obelisk, but Bernini would not have been Bernini if he had not managed to outshine the obelisk itself. I mean, we see it there, and if we look closely you can see that there's a dove on the top carrying an olive branch. That's a reference to both the Holy Ghost, the dove that came back to Noah's Ark to signal that the water was receding, but most of all to the family coat of arms of the Pamphili family, which is this one. But the obelisk is carried by this sculpted sort of rock formation, and on its 4 sides there are 4 personifications of rivers or river gods, each symbolizing one of the great 4 rivers. And these 4 rivers were considered the great rivers of the 4 continents, that is, Europe, Africa, Asia and America. And the rivers are the Danube for Europe, the Ganges for Asia, the Nile for Africa, and the Rio Plata for America. Now, let's start with the Danube and make our way around the fountain, and we'll see all the little details that you can pick up there. The Danube, of course, is the closest river to Rome, and as a choice for the greatest river of Europe, it's a really good one as it runs through so much of it. But the river god that we see here, that represents the Danube, you can see that he has his right hand on the coat of arms of the Pope. They will usually tell you that that was done to show that it's the closest one to the Pope geographically. But that's not really true, because on the other side, you'll see in a minute, that the Nile is doing exactly the same thing. It's just the great big rivers that are holding up the Pope's coat of arms, and that of his family, I guess. But this figure representing the Danube, you can also see that he seems to be startled. He seems to respond to something happening a little further along, which, as we will see in a while, is the Rio Plata. But we are moving in the other direction where we find the Ganges. And the god representing the Ganges is carrying an oar, or perhaps it's a very big oar that can be used as a rudder. The idea was that the Ganges was easy to navigate for ships. And then we see, of course, this lovely lion having a drink from the fountain in between the Ganges and the Nile. The Nile has his face hidden in a veil, because the origins of the Nile had not yet been found, and when we move further along we see the tail of the lion sticking out there. And then we get to the Rio Plata, which is in South America, and I think it flows into the sea in Argentina. And I suppose it got its name from the idea that they would find lots and lots of silver there, because plata of course means silver in Spanish. And you can see that he's sitting on a large stack of coins there below his arm. Now, there's a story about this one that is told by tour guides in Rome all the time and is one of those stories every Roman knows, but which is in fact not true. And that story is this one. You can see that this river god is reacting to something. He's startled. He has lifted his hand, and the story goes that he has lifted that hand to shade his eyes from the view of the church right next to the fountain. That is the Sant'agnese in Agone, which was built by Borromini. So it was built by the competitor of Bernini, and it's as if it reacts and views it with horror and doesn't want to see it and covers its own eyes. But in reality, that's not true. This is not the case. The river god is not responding to whatever he sees in this church. We know this because the work on the church didn't start until the fountain was done. And apparently this river god already sat like this in the earliest sketches, when Bernini hadn't even decided what side every river would be on. And if we look a little bit further, we can see what he's actually reacting to. There's a snake a little bit higher up, and that has apparently startled him. In fact, it's the same thing that the Danube is reacting to as well. Remember, that's the first river god we saw. Now, there's another story to this fountain, and that's about the obelisk. It was found in the circus of Maxentius. That had been built on the other side of Rome in the 3rd century. It was in pieces, so it had to be restored, and it was bought by Innocent X. And there had been a lot of these obelisks that the Romans had taken from Egypt. Many of them had simply been stolen from Egyptian temples, but some of them had been made as commissions by Romans. And this particular obelisk was thought to have originally been brought to Rome by Emperor Caracalla. At least, that's what they thought in the 17th century. Now, when Pope Innocent X brought it, he also hired the services of a man called Athanasius Kircher. And Kircher was a Jesuit scholar and at the time considered a polymath. He wrote at least 40 books on different and extremely diverse subjects, such as medicine, geology, music, comparative religion, and astronomy. In his work on astronomy, he mostly tried to find different explanations for the observations that had led Galileo Galilei to conclude that the Earth revolves around the Sun. So basically, Kircher wrote an entire book trying to disprove that. And he was one of those peculiar figures that gained immense amounts of knowledge and with it managed to write books in which he was spectacularly wrong about a wide range of subjects. And this includes his book on the translations of hieroglyphs, because he claimed that he could translate hieroglyphs, particularly the ones on this obelisk. And he believed that they contained some sort of higher truth, even though he knew that they predated the Bible. And it was actually on his insistence that this obelisk was to be placed on the Piazza Navona in the first place. And for that reason, the fountain was made. So he translated these hieroglyphs, and the translation, in Latin, can be seen on each side of the obelisk. Now, with this introduction, it won't surprise you that his translation makes no sense whatsoever. But, of course, no one else could translate it either until the Rosetta Stone was found about a century and a half later, and from that, hieroglyphs were finally deciphered. So on this obelisk we find the wrong translation. And when finally in 1827 someone got around to translating it using the new knowledge gained from the Rosetta Stone, they found out something amusing. This obelisk was commissioned by a Roman emperor in Egypt. Or else it was brought over to Rome blank, without any writing on it. Because the text was written for Romans, because it refers to 3 different Roman people. And they just happened to be Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. This obelisk, it turns out, was commissioned and made for Emperor Domitian, the very same man who had the Circus Argonus, the original sports arena, built. And it wasn't made for this location. It was probably meant for a temple that he had erected for his father and brother, who he had deified, and it seems that he hoped that he would be added as a god to their temple at some point after he died. So without anyone knowing it, in the 17th century, they brought back an obelisk made by the same man who was at the origin of this square in the first place. Now, when the fountain was unveiled in 1651, it was admired by lovers of art, but not so much by the general population. I mean, they liked the fountain well enough, but the problem was that the Pope had spent quite a bit of money on it, and in the years before it was finished, there had been a famine in the city, and people protested by writing anonymous letters that were hung up on certain walls, and they said stuff along the lines of, "We want bread, not fountains." And I guess I can see their point. But once it was unveiled, generally people loved it, just not the money spent on it. Now there's one more story I want to show you briefly, and that's the one behind this painting. The Pope, Innocent X, had a sister-in-law. She was called Olympia. Her husband, the brother of the Pope, had died, and Innocent X and Olympia were very close after that. So much so that it was always rumored that she was his mistress. But in 1652 she had what I would call a great idea. She had the drains on the piazza closed in the midst of summer and put up some dikes on the edges of the piazza, which meant that the water could flow in through the fountains but couldn't escape. So the entire piazza was flooded to a depth of about 50 centimeters. And once it had been done, she would have races with carriages of the wealthy through this flooded piazza. And the regular people of the city were invited to come to see how the rich made fools of themselves in the summer heat. It became a tradition where the piazza would be flooded 1 or 2 weeks in summer, and general water play would take place there. And it lasted until 1866. And nowadays, when you visit the piazza, especially in the height of summer, I'm sure you could imagine how much fun it would be if they did this again. But of course, you want to visit this place immediately, and I would recommend doing that at least at some point. But before you go, I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.